Hi, everyone. I hope you're enjoying reading the final parts of Into the Wild. It's one of my favorite books, so I'm really hoping that this was something that you liked as well. So we're going to talk about a few different items in Into the Wild. And so let's begin with thinking about Chris McCandless. And so my first question for you is to think about who is Alexander Supertramp. Now, hopefully you know the answer to that. He is Chris McCandless, right? This is an actual photo of him by his bust, by the way, that he took. But I want you to think more in a literary sense or a metaphorical sense. Who is Alexander Supertramp? Why does he decide to rename himself? And how is he different than Chris McCandless? And it's also an interesting exercise to think, when did he actually become Alexander Supertramp? At what point in his journey did he feel like he had made this transition into a new person? And then also thinking about, does this new persona in his accompanying manifesto help Alex become who he wants to be? So obviously he feels like he's searching, he's trying, he wants to be something different than he was born. And so does this work? Does this help him? Do you think that he dies a martyr, for example, someone who died doing what they believed in, and so the death in some way was righteous? Certainly a lot of people think of Chris McCandless or Alexander Supertramp as a martyr, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. Do you think he would? This is, of course, complicated by the fact that we have to keep in mind that Chris McCandless did not write Into the Wild. Jon Krakauer wrote Into the Wild. So Chris McCandless on his journey was mostly alone, right? So this is not like, especially 2023, where people might take selfies of their journeys and then post it to Instagram or Twitter or Snapchat. He really was alone, and he was not sharing his experience with anyone. He did not write this story. Jon Krakauer wrote this story. So that complicates things a bit, right? Sometimes as readers, we can confuse the subject matter for the writer. And a lot of times after reading this, there's mixed reactions to Chris McCandless. They're kind of all over the board, the reaction to Chris McCandless and what he decided to do. But sometimes that reaction in some ways has to be more aimed at Jon Krakauer, who is the writer, because Chris McCandless wasn't aiming to share his story, right? Jon Krakauer shared his story. And in doing so, he really identifies with Chris McCandless, right? And so we see in different ways how this is true. I have selected a photo from Outside Magazine. It's based on his book Into Thin Air. It was a climbing expedition he did on Mount Everest. I'm not spoiling anything. If you want to read Into Thin Air, you'll find out very quickly that people died on this expedition. Jon Krakauer is not one of them. He comes back to write about it. So if you did like this style of writing and this book and even the subject matter, I highly recommend Into Thin Air. Also, Jon Krakauer has many books. They're all very good. So something to think about or check out. But he obviously identifies with Chris McCandless to some degree. And he says this, right? We don't even have to speculate. He says that he identifies with him. So what writerly moves does he make to identify with Chris McCandless? And we want to think about that kind of in structure, not just content, because he talks a little bit about his family, his stories, things like that. But he also switches between first and third person. So we see that in the structure. He goes back and forth in terms of the whole structure of the novel, talking about Chris McCandless, talking about himself, going back to Chris McCandless. So if you look at those different pieces and how they're laid out, and where Jon Krakauer is talking about himself and where is he talking about Chris McCandless, how is he making his influence as a writer known? How is his influence as a writer making our lens of Chris McCandless either positive or negative? And Jon Krakauer is very aware of this, right? He writes about how he knows that how we see Chris McCandless is much to do with his pen, right? So he's very aware of this and he's very careful about this. And if you remember from the last lecture, that this book actually came out of an article. So he self-corrects a bit in the book from the article, because this is a longer project. He had more time with it. So a lot of interesting writerly things are happening too. And it's also interesting to think about as a reader, how much we're learning about Chris McCandless, but also how much we're learning about Jon Krakauer. And this is kind of an interesting experiment to do with anyone around us, especially if they're talking about another person, is if you hear someone talking about another person, how much are we actually learning about the person that they're talking about versus the person doing the talking, right? Because you could have a person, like, let's just say they're neutral subject matter, if such a thing existed. And one person could talk really glowingly about them and say that they're so great, they're wonderful. And another person could say how horrible they are, how they dislike them, these are all their flaws. And we have to wonder sometimes, are we really learning about the person, that subject matter? Are we learning about the people talking? Jon Krakauer, of course, is aware of this, this issue. He's definitely aware of it. And so he's trying to take very careful writerly steps to avoid making mistakes with the story. But that doesn't mean not influencing the story, because he knows he's influencing the story, but he's trying to make very careful writerly steps by incorporating his first person, also very careful research, to make sure that he's telling the story as correctly as possible, if such a thing is possible. And that brings us to our last point. So this last picture that I have is Krakauer, excuse me, see, I just made the mistake myself. It's Chris McCandless's bus being airlifted out of the Alaska wilderness. So this is a real photo. This happened in 2020. And what was happening were people were taking trips to see the bus. So it was like they were going on a pilgrimage to see where Chris McCandless died. People who really identified with him or wanted to take the journey for themselves. And people wanted to take photos of themselves in front of the bus. And people died doing this. People got lost. People had to be rescued looking for Chris McCandless's bus. So they decided that the bus needed to go. So they airlifted it out of the Alaska wilderness. But before that happened, Jon Krakauer makes a visit. And so this is part of his research. And this is a part of kind of like his obsession with trying to understand Chris McCandless. So how would you characterize his visit to the bus? Is this something he's doing for his research? Is it something he's doing for himself? Do you think it helps him understand? And that's also another writerly question, right? Does good writing depend on seeing the subject matter firsthand? So Krakauer could have certainly written this book never visiting the Alaska wilderness, but he did. And do you think that's helpful? Do you think that's important? So just some things to think about in terms of not just the story itself, but the writing of the story and also the research of the story. Primary research versus secondary research, firsthand knowledge versus secondhand knowledge. And how does Jon Krakauer put all of those items together to create this story? And then ultimately, what's your opinion, right? What's your takeaway of this story at the end of the day? So I hope you enjoyed, and we are going to talk about it more in the coming week. And I hope you definitely, wherever you sit in your feelings about Chris McCandless, got something out of it.